The Reformed theologian J.H. Alstead famously once said that the doctrine of justification is the article by which the church stands and falls. For that reason, it's long been seen as the central dividing line between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism.
That is where we disagree.
I was raised in the Protestant tradition, and I'm still happily Protestant. However, what I was taught about justification, and more specifically what I was taught that Roman Catholics believe about justification, included errors and misrepresentations. Let me explain what I used to believe. I was taught that justification is God declaring us righteous. It happens at the moment we place our faith in God, when He turns us from enemies of God into children of God. This is not earned, but a free gift. I was also taught that Roman Catholics deny justification by faith and instead believe we're saved by faith and works. They declared Protestants heretics at the Council of Trent in the 16th century, saying, "If anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, let him be anathema." Paul is forceful in his condemnation of salvation by works, saying things like, "You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace." So verses like that were taken to mean that if you believe works save you, you're severed from Christ. That is, you're not a Christian. It's another gospel, one where you try to earn your salvation by the good things you do.
I'm a good person.
And that led me and many other Protestants to conclude that Roman Catholics preach a false gospel and are therefore an apostate tradition.
That is heresy.
Now, many of my Protestant friends listening are nodding their heads in agreement. They're saying, yep, that's exactly what I believe. But in this video, I want to tell you 3 things I was never taught about the Protestant and Roman Catholic divide on justification. Things you probably haven't heard either. For example, you might be surprised that Pope Francis could say this about Martin Luther and the doctrine of justification.
Io credo che le intenzioni di Martin Lutero non erano sbagliate e oggi luterani e cattolici, protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione. Su questo punto tanto importante lui non aveva sbagliato.
Let's unpack how we got here and what both sides have actually said about justification over the centuries. In 1541, leading Protestant and Roman Catholic theologians met in Regensburg, Germany, to see if they could resolve their theological differences and restore unity. Remarkably, they actually reached an agreement on the doctrine of justification.
Finally, something we agree on.
Justification by faith alone, apart from works, was a core distinctive of the Reformers. So for Protestants and Catholics to come to a shared understanding was a monumental achievement.
It was a huge success.
John Calvin, who was present there as an observer, wrote to a friend just days after the justification article was finalized, saying, "You will be astonished, I am sure, that our opponents have yielded so much. Nothing can be comprehended within this agreement, which is not to be found in our writings." On the Catholic side, Cardinal Contarini expressed his joy to the Pope's grandson, writing, "God be praised. These Catholic and Protestant theologians resolved to agree on the article of justification, faith, and works." But the success of the agreement on this doctrine was overshadowed by a failure to agree on other key issues, especially the nature of the Eucharist.
Transubstantiation.
Historian Anthony Lane points out that at this time in church history, quote, "the doctrine of justification had not been defined by the church." So open discussions and compromise were possible. But doctrines like transubstantiation were proclaimed at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which meant that they were non-negotiable. In other words, Catholics could debate justification, but they couldn't budge on doctrines that had already been defined by prior councils. This colloquy ultimately failed because its scope was too broad.
Guys, can we focus?
It grouped together doctrines where unity was possible with others where compromise was impossible. So even though real agreement was reached on justification, the whole effort fell apart, and that historic moment was lost.
We were so close!
Then just 4 years later at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church formally rejected and condemned the Protestant view. In my Protestant circles, justification had one fixed definition. It was a legal declaration where God instantly declares a sinner righteous by faith alone. No one ever mentioned that this understanding came out of the Reformation or that others like Roman Catholics define the word differently.
They have a slightly different meaning.
It was simply assumed that this was the definition. But here's something worth thinking about, fellow Protestants. If I told you that sanctification requires effort, obedience, and good works, would you object?
That sounds right.
You wouldn't. We all agree that sanctification is synergistic. God doesn't just kill the sin in our life passively.
Hey, I'll sit here and do nothing.
You don't rest on faith alone to grow in holiness. Now, here's where things get interesting. What if someone defined the word justification differently so that it includes our definition of sanctification in it? If that was the case, then an objection to justification with that definition by faith alone starts to make a lot more sense. And that's exactly what Roman Catholics do. Roman Catholics aren't denying that initial justification is by grace through faith. They're just using the word justification to mean something broader. Let me show you what I mean. The Modern Catholic Dictionary by Father John Hardon defines justification as the process of a sinner becoming justified or made right with God. That word process is key. Protestants don't see justification as a process, but as a verdict that happens in a moment.
We find the defendant not guilty.
A declaration by God that we are righteous because of Christ. But Catholic theology goes further. It defines justification as including this. On the positive side, it is the supernatural sanctification and renewal of a person who thus becomes holy and pleasing to God and an heir of heaven. The Catechism of the Catholic Church confirms this when it says, justification is not only the remission of sins, but also the sanctification and renewal of the interior man. In other words, for Catholics, justification includes sanctification. It's not just about being forgiven, it's about being transformed. And yes, they believe that initial justification happens by grace through faith apart from works. But after that, they believe the believer must cooperate with God's grace in order to grow in holiness. Here's the thing, Protestants believe this too, we just don't call it justification, we call it sanctification. So when Catholics and Protestants argue over justification by faith alone, it's not a disagreement about the gospel itself, it's a disagreement about how the word justification is defined. Protestants separate justification and sanctification, whereas Catholics combine them under one term. Once these terms were clearly defined, it became clear that much of the division was rooted in misunderstanding.
Are we understanding each other?
Not actual disagreement. Which brings us to the third thing I never knew. In 1999, Roman Catholics and Lutherans sat down to resolve one of the central disputes of the Reformation, the doctrine of justification. The result was a historic document called the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. It aimed to overcome centuries of controversy and misunderstanding, and effectively resolved one of the key theological conflicts of the Reformation: how we are saved. This agreement was initially signed by the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church.
Reformation Day became the time of historic agreement. On October the 31st, 1999, the Vatican and the Lutheran World Federation laid the cornerstone for a new fellowship in Augsburg, Germany, the city that was so important in that long-ago quarrel.
In the years since, it has also been signed by the World Methodist Council in 2006, the World Communion of Reformed Churches in 2017, and the Anglican Communion in 2017. So, what exactly did they agree on? Here's what they confessed together. Together we confess, by grace alone, in faith in Christ's saving work, and not because of any merit on our part, we are accepted by God and receive the Holy Spirit, who renews our heart while equipping and calling us to good works. They also say of justification, it tells us that as sinners, our new life is solely due to the forgiving and renewing mercy that God imparts as a gift, and we receive in faith, and never can merit in any way. So what about good works? Both sides affirm that good works are necessary, not to earn justification, but as the natural fruit of it. They jointly declare, we confess together that good works, a Christian life lived in faith, hope, and love, follow justification and are its fruits. And they also clarify terminology that scares Protestants, like referring to the meritorious nature of good works. Here's how Catholics explain that. When Catholics affirm the, quote, meritorious character of good works, they wish to say that, according to the biblical witness, a reward in heaven is promised to these works. Their intention is to emphasize the responsibility of persons for their actions, not to contest the character of these works as gifts, or far less to deny that justification always remains the unmerited gift of grace. Now you might wonder, does this mean that the Roman Catholic Church has walked back the Council of Trent's condemnation of the Protestant view of justification by faith? Well, yes and no. The Declaration states that the Reformation-era condemnations are still valid to the original audience based on the understandings of that time. But they do not apply to today's partners based on their new understanding. In fact, the document explicitly says that the remaining differences on justification are, quote, no longer the occasion for doctrinal condemnations. And that, in light of this consensus, the corresponding doctrinal condemnations of the 16th century do not apply to today's partner. That means continuing to say that Roman Catholics condemn Protestants for believing in justification by faith alone is outdated and inaccurate, at least for those Protestant bodies who have affirmed this declaration. And just as Catholics no longer apply Trent's condemnations, Lutherans also do not apply their own confessional condemnations to modern Catholics based on this shared understanding. So while nuanced differences remain, the substance of this doctrine has been agreed upon. Justification by grace through faith is not a doctrine that still divides Protestants and Catholics.
E oggi luterani e cattolici, ma protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione.
For today's question, I want to know how many of these facts were new to you. Were you taught any of these growing up, whether that be Catholic or Protestant? Let me know in the comments. If you want to go deeper into the common ground now shared between Protestants and Catholics on the doctrine of justification, check out Justification and the Future of the Ecumenical Movement, the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, edited by William G. Rush. This collection of essays written by theologians involved in or responding to the Joint Declaration explores how the historic 1999 agreement came about, what it means, and where the dialogue is heading. It's an honest and informed look at one of the most significant moments in post-Reformation church history. I've got a link to the book in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. If you found it helpful, would you mind clicking like before you leave? And if you want more content like this in your feed, click subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you in the next video.